Hello, everyone. Salam and greetings of peace from Granada, Spain. This is the first time in, I think, 4 or 5 years that I haven't been able to attend an IPRA conference. I'm very disappointed to not be physically there with my peace family, but I hope you're all safe and you're maintaining social distances and taking all these safety measures that we have to think about right now. I would also like to congratulate the entire IPRA Secretariat and especially Professor Matt Meyer and Professor Christine for organizing this conference under these stressful times and circumstances that we never thought of before. And I would like to thank you for continuing to make the effort to promote global peace around the world because as we have just now entered into this new decade, we need a lot more space for these conversations, and we also need to provide spaces to researchers to be able to claim up this space. So thank you very much. It's an honor, as usual, to be a part of the IPRA conference, even though it's virtually this year, but still an honor. I personally found the theme of taking the role of technologies in contemporary peace building to be very, very intriguing and exciting. And it got me thinking a lot about how it connects to my own work. And I was constantly thinking about how technology has impacted global terrorism, which in turn has impacted how governments are run these days, be it the way in which elections are held or the idea of revolution and how the revolution has impact how technology has impacted revolution. So with all these a lot of these ideas were in my head, and then I started thinking of whether it would be better to have a case study in mind to understand all of these concepts. And two things came to my mind ultimately. One was the idea of the Islamic revival in the Middle East and North African region, mainly the case study of Egypt. And then I wanted to look at Hannah Arendt's theories of violence and government and terrorism, and to see how the work of a German theorist fits into the case study of Egypt, or like does it fit at all, or even if it doesn't. So in this presentation, I'll be looking at the Islamic revival in Egypt, but through two things, which are the Islamic Brotherhood and the mosque movement, which is also known as the Piety movement, according to Saba Mahmood. Um, the Islamic Brotherhood, as most of you I'm sure are aware of, is a political, religious party, revolution, movement, very vague. But they have been present in the politics. It's obviously patriarchal, it's governmental, but it's very masculine. And then on the other hand, happening at the same time in Egypt, which we have the mosque movement, which was initiated by the women of Cairo, who basically decided that they wanted to analyze Islam and Quranic teachings and understand how Islam fits into their day to day lives. And this is happening at the time when Egypt is going through governmental change. They're trying to get democracy. So, how does all of this come together? And what is the role of technology in this? So, in Egypt today, the Islamic movement is associated with modern citizens, which is a drastic change from how we have seen Islamic movements in the past. The Iranian Revolution of 1979 is often argued by modern scholars as like a regressive movement because, for a number of reasons, women were asked to cover themselves again, and educational opportunities for women were very limited. But then in the North African region today, we see that it's a modern movement. It's the young people that want to be a part of this movement, which lays emphasis, which has a very interesting link to Hannah Arendt's theories about political power, because she says that the role of revolution has always been freedom, and that wars can only be justified if they're fought with the idea of revolution. So not power, not violence, just the idea of revolution is what justifies wars. And then she defines power as a collective attribute or a collective movement to act in a way that is just and peaceful. And she goes on to say that power does not need justification, it needs legitimacy, and that a revolution will only occur if this legitimacy is challenged. So basically, she's trying to say that power is when revolution will happen if when the legitimacy of power is challenged, which again I think links very interestingly to the whole idea of Egypt. And it is um it is an interesting notion because with regards to women rights in Egypt and their political changes, their government has been constantly under attack. And I think these definitions highlight the tension in Egypt between feminism and religion. Because on one hand, we have the dictatorships of Hosni Mubarak and Nasser, who are heavily criticized for not taking gender-based violence into account. And then since 2011, we've had more than 500 cases of sexual harassment in Egypt, and Abdel Fattah al-Sisi's government has been constantly under pressure to address the rights of women. And it makes you think about, where does gender, religion, power, violence, and politics come together? And then broadly, it makes you think that this debate is not contemporary. It's been there for a long, long time. And especially in Egypt, we can see it from the very beginning to the history of the Muslim Brotherhood itself. So the Muslim Brotherhood, I would like to give you a very quick, brief review of it. It was founded in 1928 by Hassan al-Banna, who was a school teacher. And then this was at the time when Egypt was still under colonial rule of the British. So they were trying, the whole point of the Islamic movement was to get the Egyptians to lead a life according to Islamic traditions. And by the 1940s, this is almost like a decade and a half of their existence, they had more than 1 million followers. And in 1949, Hassan al-Banna was assassinated by the state security forces. And then if you move fast forward to the 2000s, and we see the Islamic Brotherhood in government after the Arab Spring. And then we see Sisi's government taking over because of the political unrest. So again, this ties to Hannah Arendt's definition of terror, which she says is the form of government that uses violence to legitimize its rule. Again, a very interesting definition of terrorism in modern times. I personally find it very intriguing that she links terrorism directly to a government. Um, Sorry, I'm like rambling on and on a lot about Egypt, but then to think about, where do women fit in all of this? Um, Historically, I don't have time to go into the historical role of women in Islamic societies, but women have been very active. They've always represent women in Islamic history have participated in wars. They have participated in trade. They have helped. They've provided emotional, financial, and even physical support at times needed. Egypt itself, very cliche example, Cleopatra. So it's not like women are not at the forefront of movements, and particularly Islamic revival movements. But then we also see that power is very linked to masculinity, and power and political revolution is linked to the idea of patriarchy, where things are adjusted. Like women are there are very defined gender roles, and women are expected to adhere to certain things, which is counted as their contribution to political revolutions, not related to technology at all. An example of is that of the Islamic Revolution of 1979, where men were encouraged to go out and fight, and according to the idea of jihad, but for women, they were told that the idea that their jihad is to wear the hijab. And so religious symbolism, this physicality of symbolism, has really determined government legitimacy in Islamic societies. Hassan al-Banna, for example, in the Islamic Brotherhood, declared that a woman only belongs inside her house and she can only exist as a mother, a wife, and a housekeeper. And it's interesting to note here that while Banna was promoting all this ideology, there were women sitting in mosques in Cairo that were figuring out Islam. They were figuring out how Islam fits into the mold of their day to day lives. And these women were not just women who were wearing the hijab or the niqab. There were women that were working in offices. There were women that were driving to the mosque to learn these things, to learn what Islam says about the rights of women. These are women that are taking control of the translation of the Quran, that are analyzing the text from a feminist point of view. And this leads to the question of why is the mosque movement not talked about when we talk about the Arab Spring or political revolution, or we talk about technology and peace building? And why is it broadly, why are women based movements ignored in the conversation about peace? And going on of this is that the idea of like how we see here that the Muslim Brotherhood has constantly gone up and down, like their ideologies have been changing, the way they're viewed, um, from like a revolutionary movement to Islamist movement, and then more recently in 2018, the U.S. president, former U.S. President Trump, declared them as an international terrorist organization. So how do we define a revolution? Firstly, um, and I think that we cannot, with unless we look at gender. And I talked earlier about religious symbolism, which is reinforcing these patriarchal structures. And the difference between the mosque movement and the Islamic Brotherhood is that the mosque movement managed to surpass differences of class, status, and gender. Because this movement included housewives, students, working class women, who some of whom wore skirts, others who covered their heads. And I want to say here that the participants of the mosque movement, they challenged the very basis of an Islamic revival. They challenged the very basis of what Islamic revolution was perceived to be. Because they were not just people that were going to the mosque. I mean, like, you, this is how you pray, this is how you do things. But they asserted that the movement was born out of need for religious knowledge, because they were becoming increasingly marginalized under a secular government, and a government, as Hannah Arendt would say, that had legitimized power. Um, but there were obviously certain limitations of this mosque movement, which is why it's not talked about as much. It was again very gender segregated. Women were not allowed to preach to men. They had very limited space. They were not. They were forbidden from delivering the sermon. Excuse me, on Fridays. But even now, I would argue that it has a lot of potential. And since this conference is about technology and the role of peace building in technology, I want to assert that one of the biggest gifts of technology to us is the ability to transfer knowledge, across borders, across the world, and hopefully across planets very soon. And what this has done is that it has made legitimacy of law and rule an international problem. So everyone has access to knowledge, everyone has access to information that allows us to form an opinion about things. And again, Egypt is a good example of this, because we can see the trajectory of how they revised family law, how they revised laws regarding women rights. And I want to go through some of the more important laws, because I think it's it's helpful to understand the impact of the Islamic Brotherhood and this mosque movement. So, the most important and arguably the most controversial law that was passed in Egypt was the Law 1 of 2000, which granted women the right to file for divorce without the consent of their husband. And also, it allowed them to file for the right to divorce in the case that the marriage was not registered. Law 10 of 2004 introduced the system of family courts, and Law 11 of the same year established the Family Insurance Fund, which allowed women to collect child support, which was given by the court. The amendments in the child law of 2008 included it raised the minimum legal age of marriage for women to 18. Female genital mutilation (FGM) was criminalized, and children who were not aware of who their father was were legally allowed to adopt their mother's name. Other measures included that the mother can have the legal custody of the children until they're 15. The amendment of the Egyptian nationality law in 2004 gave children of Egyptian mothers married to a foreign national the equal citizenship rights as that of Egyptian fathers. And again, an interesting parallel to the governmental systems, we can see this is the rule of Hosni Mubarak, famously openly recognized as a dictator overthrown by the Arab Spring. But we can see that he has done, at least on paper, at least at least constitutionally, more for gender equality than an elected government. Which again, to conclude, I'm sorry I gave you a lot of information. But to conclude, I want to say that the mosque movement, um, invisible, as one could argue in the case study of Egypt, but it highlights the role of Islamic feminism as an analytical and a political project. And I think moving forward, in order to bring together all of these concepts and to bring together the feminist tradition in Egypt, there are questions that need to be asked. And there are questions that are not on a personal level or on a political level. These are questions that need to be asked on a global level. And with the current situation in Egypt, with the absence of the mosque movement in political discourse, with the revival of the Islamic Brotherhood, as we see after the Arab Spring, it's it's difficult to analyze what is the current status of women in Egypt, because the elected Brotherhood, President Morsi's list of 64 promises to achieve within his first terms of office, it included no reference to women's rights. Um, in fact, under the rule of the Brotherhood, or the very brief rule that they had before Sisi's government took over, they repealed the right of women to seek divorce, and they reduced maternal custody to 7 years for boys and 10 for girls. So these constitutional changes that came into effect in December 2012 were a strong blow to women's rights and to the feminist movement in Egypt in general. And we can conclude here that there's Hannah Arendt's theory, while it is easier to explain in terms of this very patriarchal expected notion of what a political revolution is, what a governmental change is, but it does not take into account the link between feminism and religion, which I think is a very important connection that we need to understand what is happening in the Middle East, in the North African region, but also in Islamic societies in general. And maybe going forward, we need to redefine what this means. We need to redefine what feminist laws mean. We need to redefine what Islamic laws mean. Because again, when Sisi comes into power in 2014, women are granted legal rights, but it's the social norms and the perceptions that are now stopping them from getting what they want is the gender based bias that we see in play in Egypt and in a lot of countries around the world. So while I give you a lot of information, I also leave you with a lot of questions here about how do we redefine a global concept such as feminism, a concept that transcends boundaries, that transcends race, caste, religion, color, but then at the same time, it's so personal. And at the same time, it's being viewed as on a governmental level, is being reviewed on a national level. So how do we bring together? And again, I want to tie it back to the importance of technology, because technology is the single factor that binds things together, that allows us to have access to information, that enables us to understand how the world is and how it's going forward. And it allows us to see the similarities and differences in our culture, which is mainly the point of this IPRA conference as well, for us to come together and to reflect on how we can improve and how we can see. And I really hope that following this conversation, women will be allowed to be a part of legal, social, political, literary conversations, and that we can work towards bridging the gap between legal rights granted to women, women rights movements, and what actually happens when women step out of their house into society. Thank you for listening. Have a great day. Thank you so much. Bye.